Hey there. So this week, some things got a little out of whack, and I'm not going to be able to do the video that I was intending to do. So to meet my Tuesday deadline, I'm going to do a sort of less produced thing. This will, of course, not be charged to the patrons. This is not a produced video, and I don't charge patrons for videos that are not produced. But I'm also kind of excited because this screw up on my part gives me the opportunity to address some issues that I don't think I would have gotten the chance to go into otherwise. I'm specifically going to deal with two news items from last week. The first is the deficit. The 2018 deficit is supposed to be, this is the U.S. budget deficit, is supposed to be pretty close to $1 trillion, which is pretty crazy for a period of time when the economy is doing well. And the other story I want to deal with is the fact that the Centers for Disease Control are going to have less money than they have had recently. These are significant developments. And both of them got a lot of play last week, but what nobody really focused on is how closely connected these two issues are. So that's what I'm going to try and do today. Well, first off, we have the deficit. This is an issue that both the Republicans and Democrats claim to care about when the other guy is in power. Looking at it objectively, the Republicans are much worse on this issue than the Democrats. Clinton did manage to balance a budget or two. Obama certainly had some horrific deficits that led to the debt that we're in right now, but that came about as the result of bipartisan measures that were taken to deal with the 2008 crisis. That's supposed to be how these things work. When the economy screws up, you need to keep things going, get things going again, avert a larger crisis, so the government is supposed to spend a lot of money. We're now in, supposedly, despite the ongoing stock market correction that could very well be getting much worse as this video uploads, we're supposedly in a great economic period. Things are supposed to be going very well. So it's kind of crazy that the deficits, the amount of money that the U.S. government is spending over the amount of money that's coming in, that the deficit for 2018 is expected to get to like $1 trillion. We've now got a national debt that is over $20 trillion, and this is kind of crazy by historical standards. Basically, when a country gets this far into debt, there are supposed to be consequences. People are supposed to get less willing to lend money to a country. Now, the United States has been in a weird position over the past 10 years since the financial crisis. Gosh, that was fall of 2008. Yep, almost 10 years ago. The United States' balance sheet has been getting worse and worse, like dramatically worse and worse. Back in the Reagan era, people used to flip out about a deficit of $200 billion. That was big. Now, multiple years in the Obama administration, we had deficits of over $1 trillion. That's just 1 year racking up $1 trillion worth of debt. And now it looks like we're going to have that, I don't know, every year in the Trump administration after these tax cuts. So that's pretty crazy. But since the crisis in 2008, everybody else has been just as screwed. Nobody's confident enough in the Chinese government yet to start investing heavily in their government debt. The euro has pretty obviously been a nightmare. The European Union has been a nightmare for all of the time since the financial crisis as well. Britain, the British pound and the British economy used to be sort of a safe haven, but obviously since Brexit, that's ridiculous, and they were also hurt during the crisis. So the thing is, the United States has managed to avoid getting into that situation where people don't want to lend us money anymore because there's really nobody else. There's nobody else's debt to buy. That situation is not going to be true forever, but everybody in Washington, D.C. is acting like it is. I think it was Dick Cheney who famously said, deficits don't matter. This is not a sustainable situation. The fact that we've convinced ourselves that deficits don't matter anymore means that they've just ballooned out of all proportion, and it puts us in a really vulnerable situation. If there's another financial crisis that doesn't affect the rest of the world as badly as it does us, which is possible because I think the rest of the world is learning that it needs less exposure to the U.S. economy. If that happens, we may very quickly find ourselves in a situation where nobody wants to lend money to us anymore. And, you know, you hear about this sort of fiscal ceiling thing, how that's periodically a problem where, like, the Republicans don't want to raise the debt ceiling. Well, how about if nobody wants to lend us money anymore, or they want to lend us money but at a much, much higher interest rate? We're in a position now that, I mean, probably not in the next year or so or the next 10 years or so, but if we continue on this trajectory, like 10 years from now, 20 years from now, definitely, we could get into a position where all of a sudden it's not a question of, gosh, we really should cut the budget. It's a question of, oh gosh, we really have to cut the budget, or we have to default. We have to stop paying our debts. We have to stop paying for our responsibilities to retirees, or, you know, through Social Security, or we have to stop handing out Medicaid benefits, or we have to stop, you know, we have to shut down 5 of our aircraft carriers. You know, these things could become necessities. This is a real problem that is treated as if it is not a problem at all. So when I complain about this, I am complaining about Trump, I'm complaining about Obama, I'm complaining about Bush, I'm complaining about all those folks in Congress, but I'm also complaining about really everybody else in this country and all of our attitudes towards the federal government and what we expect them to do. We all need to start taking deficits and our federal budget a lot more seriously. And to move on to the second part of this video, the story I want to talk about is one that you've probably saw if you're a dedicated anti-Trumper like myself. It's the story about how the Centers for Disease Control is about to run out of money. Or at least that's how it's pitched in headline after headline. But if you make it into any of these stories, if you start reading down into the paragraphs, we're not talking about, you know, the Centers for Disease Control's, this hollowed institution in the United States. We're not talking about its budget being cut. We're not talking about its activities that it's been engaged in for decades being slowed down or ended. What we're talking about, what these articles are all talking about, is the end of a program that started in 2014. Now, back in 2014, we had the Ebola panic, and Congress decided, in a very short-term kind of way, to throw billions of dollars at this Ebola problem and to give the CDC a lot of money. Some of that was rational, some of that was useful, some of that was definitely something that was needed at that point to deal with that crisis. But I think this is indicative of how our mindset evolves and how we've gotten into this problem with the deficit. This is a program back in 2014 that was initiated in a panic and was thrown together very quickly. Involves a lot of great services. It's providing a lot of great services in a lot of other countries, which is a key part of what the CDC does and should continue. But the fact that something that happened in 2014 to deal with a short-term crisis is now all of a sudden just seen as something that the federal government has to do forever. And that's the annoying thing about this, is that everything that goes into this budgeting process, everything has got a lot of dedicated people who think it's essential. Obviously, I would probably rather the CDC was more fully funded and had more money to play with than a percentage or two of corporate tax being reduced. But I also think it is a worthwhile thing that corporate taxes were reduced. So yeah, everything is difficult like this. And we don't think honestly about this. We're not willing to make choices when we're trying to make political points. It's much easier to say, look, you know, Trump's cutting the CDC. Does he want us to all die of Ebola? Than actually looking at this kind of rationally and saying, gosh, we're kind of in a terrible place with the budget. Obviously, the CDC is going to exist and going to be doing things. Perhaps the CDC can survive with the amount of money that it was getting in 2014. It's actually probably not even the amount of money that it was getting in 2014. It's probably significantly more than that. I'm sure it outpaces inflation. Well, we'll see what the actual budget looks like. I don't know. Want to use stuff like I'm sure, but I think the point that I'm making here, and perhaps not making too well, is that we're really eager to have headlines and stories that claim that vital services are being cut when they're not really being cut. They're not really vital services. They're things that only go back a year or two. I really do think we're getting to a point where, or at least we're now in a mindset that makes a sort of deficit or debt crisis quite likely. Once again, maybe not next year, maybe not 5 years from now, but definitely 10 to 20 to 30 years from now. And I think we all need to think a little more seriously. And we need, when we see a news story like that, when we see a news story that says, Trump is cutting this, that bastard, or whoever the new president is cutting this, that bastard, we need to actually think about it a little further and look into the details before we punish people for making fiscally responsible decisions. Because we're in this terrible place where nobody who is in power wants to be responsible in the slightest, and it's this basic fiscal responsibility has become a partisan football, except neither side of the partisan divide is at all serious about it. And I'm concerned that we may reach a period before long when we all have no choice but to be very, very serious about the deficit and the national debt. Not sure how coherent that was, but I think it's important to draw those sorts of connections and realize that these news stories about the budget are not standalone things. They're all pretty connected, and it's a very important issue. I'd like to cover it more in the future. What do you guys think? Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and if you'd like to help me make videos that are usually much more polished than this one, I'd be grateful if you considered looking into my crowdfunding thing on Patreon. Thanks.